Hi, my friend, how are you? Today I'll be telling you the story of the stranger who came to the tavern during a deadly snowstorm and the prostitute who fell in love with him. You'll enjoy this blend of history and storytelling in peace before bed. First of all, please subscribe and leave a comment. I wish you a good night. It is the 12th of March, 1888, and the small tavern known as the Whitlock Inn, standing at a crossroads a half-day's ride north of New York City, is the only lit window for miles in a storm that has already, by nightfall, become one of the worst anyone in this part of the Hudson Valley can remember. Ezra Whitlock, the inn's owner, a heavy-set man in his 50s who has kept this same building running since his father passed it to him 20 years earlier, stands at the frost-caked window watching snow fall in a way he has never quite seen before, not falling so much as being hurled sideways by a wind that has been building steadily since midday, burying the road outside under drifts already taller than a grown man in places. He has already turned away 2 travelers this evening, advising them as forcefully as a tavern keeper can advise a paying customer that the roads east are impassable and that any further travel tonight risks a death Ezra has no wish to have on his conscience. And it is with this same warning, half formed on his lips, that he hears the door strain open against the wind, admitting a blast of freezing air and a single, snow-caked figure who staggers across the threshold before the door can be forced shut again behind him. The storm gathering outside the Whitlock in this same night will, within days, be remembered across the whole of the American Northeast as one of the deadliest in the region's recorded history, a system that meteorologists of the era, working without the benefit of any coordinated forecasting network, utterly failed to anticipate, so that the morning newspapers Nathaniel had read before setting out that day carried nothing more alarming than a passing mention of rain turning to light snow. By the time the storm finally exhausts itself, telegraph lines will lie snapped under the weight of ice across hundreds of miles, railway lines will stand buried and impassable for the better part of a week, and more than 400 people across the Northeast, many of them caught exposed on city streets or open roads, exactly as Nathaniel so nearly was, will not survive it, a toll that later generations will remember under the name the Great White Hurricane, spoken of with the same grim respect New Englanders reserve for the handful of storms severe enough to router, if only briefly, the ordinary business of an entire region's life. The stranger who stumbles into the tavern's firelit warmth is, even half frozen and coated in snow, unmistakably a striking man, tall and broad through the shoulders beneath his expensive, but now ruined overcoat, with the kind of even, handsome features and easy bearing that Ezra has learned, across decades of keeping a public house, tend to open doors and loosen purses wherever their owner happens to travel. He gives his name as Nathaniel Hargrove, a merchant of dry goods traveling back from business in Albany toward his home and family in New York City, caught entirely unprepared, like so many others this same night, by a storm that the morning's newspapers had described as nothing more than an ordinary spring squall. Nathaniel's journey south from Albany had begun then that morning under skies that gave no meaningful warning of what was coming. A light, unremarkable snow falling as his train made its scheduled stops down the Hudson line, and is only somewhere past Poughkeepsie as the wind began rising with a speed that alarmed even the train's veteran conductor, that the full severity of what was building around them became impossible to ignore. The train itself is eventually forced to a halt some miles short of its next scheduled stop. Drifts already piling faster than the engine can safely push through, and it is here, stranded aboard a train going nowhere with darkness falling and the temperature dropping by the hour, Nathaniel makes the decision that will carry him to the Whitlock Inn's door rather than leave him, as it very nearly did, freezing aboard an immobilized railcar alongside dozens of other passengers with nowhere better to wait out the storm. He sets out on foot, against the advice of the train's conductor and several fellow passengers, judging correctly that a crossroads inn he recalls passing on a previous business trip lies close enough to reach before the worst of the storm fully arrives, a judgment that saves his that night, even as it very nearly costs it the final quarter mile of his walk, passing in a white, disorienting blindness that leaves him, by his own later account, entirely uncertain whether he was walking toward the inn's lit window, or simply toward whatever direction his failing legs happened to. The two other travelers Ezra turned away earlier that same evening, men whose names never enter the story, the Whitlock Inn later tells about that storm, are found 3 days later, when the roads are finally cleared enough for search parties to move along them, having succumbed to the cold, not a mile from shelter they had judged wrongly they could still reach before the worst of the weather caught them. A fate that hangs unspoken over Ezra's own private relief at having admitted Nathaniel through his door in time, and one that Nathaniel himself, once he learns of it in the days that follow, carries as a private, sobering reminder of exactly how narrow the margin was between the comfortable week he is about to spend snowed in with Clara Doyle and a far colder, more permanent fate of his own. Ezra sits him by the fire, sends for hot food and drink, and privately thanks whatever Providence guidance guided the man to his door, rather than leaving him to the fate that has already, Ezra suspects, though cannot yet confirm, claimed other travelers caught out on roads and rail lines up and down the valley tonight. Word of a new arrival, and a strikingly handsome one at that, moves through the Whitlock Inn's crowded common room with the particular speed such news always travels in a house like this one, and within a quarter hour of his arrival, Nathaniel finds himself the object of considerably more attention than his half-frozen, disheveled state would ordinarily invite. The inn, like many roadside establishments of its era serving travelers on this well-used route north of the city, keeps a handful of women in its employ who see to more than the serving of ale and stew. And it is 3 of these women, drawn by the same appreciative curiosity Ezra himself felt on first seeing the stranger clearly in the firelight, who settle near Nathaniel's table with the practiced, easy charm of professionals
who have long since learned exactly how to make a weary, well-dressed traveler feel considerably less weary. by the time he's finished. Nathaniel, for his part, receives their attention with an easy, flirtatious warmth that suggests a man well accustomed to exactly this kind of welcome, trading jokes and compliments with a fluency that has clearly been practiced across many such evenings in many such rooms. And it is only the fourth woman to approach his table, arriving somewhat later than the others and considerably less obvious effort at seduction, who seems to catch and hold his attention in a way the first three had not quite managed. Her name is Clara Doyle, a woman in her late 20s with dark hair and a quiet, watchful manner that sets her apart from the livelier performance her three colleagues have been offering the room's newest and most promising all evening. She does not compete for Nathaniel's attention so much as simply exist near the edge of it, refilling mugs and clearing plates with the same brisk competence Ezra values in all staff. And it is precisely this restraint, this apparent indifference to whether the handsome stranger notices her at all, that draws Nathaniel's eye back to her again and again across the course of the evening, even as the other three women continue their considerably more determined efforts around him. The other women at the inn, Sally and Margaret Ann, and a younger girl named Fanny, who has worked at the Whitlock only since the previous autumn, have each developed across their own years in this trade a practiced repertoire of laughter and flattery calibrated to exactly the kind of well-heeled traveler Nathaniel appears to be. And Sally in particular, the eldest of the three and the sharpest-tongued, spends a good quarter hour working to hold his attention with stories of other storms she has weathered at this same crossroads, embellishing her own past winters with the easy confidence of a woman who has learned that a good story, told well, often earns more than beauty alone ever could. Nathaniel laughs at the right moments and buys a round of drinks for the table, every inch the charming, generous traveler each of the three women has met dozens of times before in dozens of similar rooms. And it is only when his gaze drifts, again and again, toward the quiet, watchful woman, clearing plates near the kitchen door, that Sally, reading the shift with the same professional eye she brings to everything else in her trade, exchanges a knowing glance with Margaret Ann and begins, gracefully and without any visible resentment, to redirect her own attention toward the doctor who has just come stamping snow from his boots by the door. When he finally addresses her directly, asking her name with a directness that carries none of the practiced charm he offered the others, Clara answers plainly, without flirtation, and it is this same plainness, Nathaniel will tell her much later that same night, that convinced him within the space of a single exchanged glance that he wanted her company above anyone else's in the crowded, firelit room. The other three women, reading the shift in Nathaniel's attention with the same practiced professional eye they had used to court it in the first place, withdraw from his table with varying degrees of grace over the following half hour, drifting instead toward other travelers stranded by the same storm, leaving Clara and Nathaniel increasingly alone at their corner table, even as the common room around them continues its noisy business of card games and storm talk, and the steady creak of a building straining against the wind outside. Their conversation, once the performance of the evening's earlier flirtation falls away, settles into something Nathaniel finds himself unprepared. Clara asking him plain, direct questions about his business in Albany, his impressions of the storm's sudden violence, ordinary texture of a traveling merchant's life, and answering his own questions about herself with the same unadorned honesty, telling him without embarrassment or excessive explanation that she came to this work after a husband's death left her with debts and no trade of her own to fall back on. Along this stretch of road that she recites it without any apparent need for his sympathy, only his understanding. She tells him more, in fact, than she has told most customers across her for 4 years, working the crossroads inns of this stretch of the Hudson Valley, describing a husband named Michael Doyle, a stonemason who fell from a half-finished bridge scaffold 2 winters before this one, leaving Clara, 25 and childless, with debts against their small rented house that no widow's meager resources could hope to satisfy through honest needlework or laundry alone. She tells Nathaniel this not to invite his pity, she makes plain, but because she has found, over the years, that a customer who understands the plain economic arithmetic behind her presence at his table treats her, more often than not, with a measure of respect that a man clinging to some romantic notion of a fallen woman rarely manages, and Nathaniel, listening, finds himself struck less by the details of the story itself, ordinary enough in a region where widows without trades have few respectable options, than by the flat, unsentimental courage with which she tells it, entirely without the self-pity he half expected, and entirely without performing for his benefit the kind of tragic vulnerability some men,
suspects might find appealing in a woman in her position. Ezra, watching from behind his bar as the evening deepens and the storm outside grows louder still, feels the particular unease of a tavern keeper who has seen enough winters and enough travelers to recognize when an ordinary evening's arrangement is shifting into something with rather more weight behind it, and he considers, more than once across that long night, whether to say something to Clara about the wisdom of losing her head over a well-dressed stranger passing through for a single night's shelter. He says nothing in the end, partly out of the same practical restraint that has served him well across 2 decades of running a house like this one, and partly because something in the particular quality of the two of them leaning close together at that corner table, oblivious now to the noise, cold pressing in around them, strikes even Ezra's weathered sensibilities as different enough from the room's ordinary business that he finds himself, against his own better judgment, reluctant to interrupt it. When Clara finally leads Nathaniel up the inn's narrow back stairs, sometime past midnight, the storm outside has reached a pitch that makes the whole building groan and shudder with each fresh gust, and what passes between them in the small room she keeps under Thebes unfolds with none of the businesslike efficiency Clara has otherwise brought to years of similar nights with similar strangers. There is a tenderness to it that catches them both by surprise, an unhurried warmth neither had quite bargained for when the evening began. And by the time they finally lie still together in the narrow bed, with the wind still screaming against the shuttered window, something has passed that neither is yet willing to name aloud, though both, lying awake long after the other has drifted towards sleep, privately recognize it as considerably more dangerous than either had any right to allow themselves that night. The storm does not release its grip on the region the following morning, nor the morning after that, and what begins as one accidental night stranded together at the Whitlock Inn stretches as the blizzard continues burying roads and rail lines under drifts that will, by the time the weather finally breaks, be measured in some places at over 40 feet, into 4 full days during which Nathaniel Hargrove has no possible means of returning to New York City, and no choice but to remain exactly where the storm has placed him. Ezra's inn fills, over those same days, with a steadily growing collection of others stranded travelers, farmers unable to reach their own homes, a doctor cut off from his rounds, a young school teacher who had set out that first morning believing the weather no worse than an ordinary spring flurry. And the whole household settles into the strange, suspended rhythm of a community thrown together by circumstances none of them chose, sharing meals, stories, and the dwindling stock of firewood as the temperature outside continues falling toward records that will stand in this region generations afterward. The doctor, a weathered man named Josiah Pierce, who had been riding toward a difficult berth, some 6 miles distant, when the storm caught him, spends much of those trapped days fretting openly over the mother and an infant he had no way of reaching, a worry the whole household comes to share as the days stretch on with no possibility of any rider braving the drifted roads to check on her. And it is this same shared, helpless concern, repeated in smaller forms across nearly every stranded guest under Ezra's roof, that binds the inn's temporary residence into something closer to an accidental family than a collection of strangers waiting out bad weather. The young school teacher, a serious, bookish woman named Prudence Marsh, who had set out that first morning intending nothing more than an afternoon visit to her sister's farm, spends the idle hours teaching the innkeeper's youngest stable hand his letters at the kitchen table, and even the farmer, among them, a taciturn man worried for livestock he has no way of reaching, gradually thaws enough to join the nightly card games that have become the household's chief entertainment once the last of the storm's fiercest hours pass and the group settles into the strange, suspended rhythm of days, with nowhere to go and nothing but each other's company to fill them. It is against this backdrop of a whole household thrown together by circumstance, everyone under Ezra's roof learning to live, at least temporarily, considerably closer to their neighbors than ordinary life ever demanded of them, that Clara and Nathaniel's own private world takes shape, almost unnoticed by the others, 2 more people among many finding unexpected company in a storm that has stripped away, for a handful of days, the ordinary boundaries and routines that would otherwise have kept them each moving through their separate lives without ever truly seeing on another at all. The second full day of the storm brings with it the household's first real test of patience, the initial novelty of shared confinement giving way. By mid-morning, to the more ordinary friction of too many people crowded too long into too small a space, tempers fraring over trivial disputes about firewood rationing and whose turn it is to help with the endless washing up. And it is Ezra himself, drawing on years of managing exactly this kind of seasonal close quarters, who diffuses the worst of it by setting the whole household to a shared task, clearing snow from the inn's own doorway and stable path before the drifts can bury them entirely inside their temporary shelter. Nathaniel, unused to manual labor of this kind, but unwilling to sit idle while others work, joins the effort alongside the farmer and the stable hand, and is Clara, watching from the kitchen window as he struggles gamely with an unfamiliar shovel, who finds herself smiling at the sight in a way that catches her own attention before it catches anyone else's. A small, unguarded moment of simple fondness that she recognizes, even as it happens, as considerably more dangerous than anything that passed between them the previous night. That same evening, after the shared labor of clearing snow has left the whole household pleasantly exhausted, Clara finds herself telling Nathaniel something she has not spoken aloud to anyone since her husband's death, describing the modest dream she and Michael had once shared of saving enough, within another 5 or 6 years of steady work, to purchase a small parcel of land upriver and keep a few dairy cows of their own, rather than renting the cramped house near the stone yard where they had spent their entire brief marriage. She tells him this not with any particular bitterness, only the plain, matter-of-fact wistfulness of a woman recounting a future that ended before it could properly begin, and Nathaniel, listening, finds himself wondering, not for the first time that week, what it might have meant to build an ordinary life alongside a woman capable of holding both such tenderness and such unflinching practicality within the same quiet temperament. He does not say this aloud, understanding even in the moment that such a thought belongs nowhere in the honest accounting either of them owes the other. But Clara, watching his face across the low kitchen fire, reads enough off of it there anyway to feel the conversation shift, however briefly, into something neither of them quite has the courage to name. By the third day, with the storm still raging, but the household now settled into a workable rhythm of shared meals and shared labor, the artificial formality that might otherwise have governed how a tavern serving woman and a well-dressed traveling merchant interact has worn away almost entirely, replaced by something closer to the easy familiarity of people who have, in effect, been living together as a small improvised family for longer than either of their ordinary lives would ever have permitted. It is on this same third day, during a quiet mid-afternoon lull, while most of the household naps or plays cards in the common room, that Nathaniel finally tells her the truth about Margaret and his children. A confession he had been circling without quite reaching for 2 full days already. And it is this confession delivered not in the heat of another stolen night together, but in the plain, unglamorous light of an ordinary afternoon, that Clara will later tell Sally she found far more affecting than anything he said or did in the privacy of her own small room. It is within this suspended, storm-bound time, days that exist entirely outside the ordinary demands of either of their separate lives. That Clara and Nathaniel's connection deepens in ways that frighten them both, even as neither makes any serious effort. They talk for hours at a stretch, in the inn's kitchen during the quiet mid-afternoon lull, on the narrow back stairs when Clara's other duties allow her a few stolen minutes, in her small room again each night, once the common room below has finally gone quiet. And it is on the third of these nights, with the storm still raging outside, though beginning, at last, to show the first signs of exhausting itself, that Nathaniel finally tells her the truth he has let her half guess without confirming since that first evening, that he has a wife in New York City, a woman named Margaret, whom he married 8 years earlier, and 2 children, a boy of 6 and a girl not yet 4, waiting for him in a comfortable house he has across 4 dazed in this small storm-bound inn, found himself thinking about with a guilt that grows heavier each time he looks at Clara across the kitchen table and feels the same unwanted lift in his chest that greeted her that very first night. Clara receives this confession with a stillness that Nathaniel cannot immediately read, and for a long moment neither of them speaks. The wind still working at the shutters outside, while the small room's single candle burns low between them. When she finally answers, it is not with the anger he had half braced himself for, nor with easy forgiveness either, but with the same plain, unflinching honesty that first drew him to her across the crowded common room days earlier, telling him that she had assumed from the quality of his overcoat and the easy confidence he carried into the tavern that first night, that a man like him very likely had a wife waiting somewhere, and that she had chosen this once against every hard lesson 4 years in this trade had taught her about the wisdom of guarding her own heart, to let herself feel something real anyway, because the alternative, spending her whole life protecting herself so completely that she never again risked feeling anything at all, had come to seem, in the quiet hours of her own private reflection, like its own kind of slow dying. Nathaniel, hearing this, finds himself undone in a way 4 days of stolen intimacy had not quite prepared him for, and it is in this moment, more than any other across their brief time together, that he understands he has fallen into something considerably more serious and more painful than the passing comfort a stranded traveler might reasonably permit himself during an unexpected storm. They do not resolve, in the 2 remaining days the blizzard grants them, the plain impossibility of what has grown between them, and neither pretends, in their more honest moments together, that any resolution exists to be found. Nathaniel cannot abandon a wife who has done nothing to deserve abandonment, nor 2 young children who know nothing of the storm that stranded their father, or the woman who kept him warm through it, and Clara, for all the tenderness she has allowed herself across these strange, suspended days, has never once asked him to consider such a thing, understanding better than he perhaps does himself that whatever this has been between them belongs entirely to the storm that created it, a small, private world with no true place in either of their ordinary lives. Once the roads finally clear, rest of the world comes rushing back in to reclaim them both. In one of their last, unguarded conversations, huddled close beside the banked coals of the kitchen hearth. After the rest of the household has finally gone to sleep, Nathaniel tries, haltingly and with evident difficulty, to explain something to Clara that he has never fully admitted, even to himself, that his marriage to Margaret, however honestly begun 8 years earlier, has settled over the intervening years into a companionable but quietly distant arrangement. Two people sharing a household and a devotion to their children without the particular kind of unguarded closeness he has found, however briefly and impossibly, in this snowbound week with a woman he met only days ago. He is careful, even in his own halting honesty, not to cast this as any fault of Margaret's, describing her instead as a good and steady wife who deserves better than a husband's wandering attention, and Clara, listening, tells him plainly that she has heard some version of this same confession from more traveling men than she can easily count, and that what makes his telling of it different, if anything does, is only that he seems genuinely troubled by it, rather than using it as a practiced excuse, a distinction she says she has learned, painfully, matters a great deal less to the wife left waiting at home than it might seem to matter in the quiet hours of a snowbound tavern kitchen. That same conversation stretches on well past the point either of them intended, the coals burning down to a dull orange glow, as Nathaniel finds hints himself, describing his children with a specificity he has not offered anyone outside his own household in years, his son's stubborn insistence on wearing the same scuffed boots every day regardless of weather, his daughter's habit of narrating her own play in a running, half-invented language only the family has learned to interpret, details that seem, even as he shares them, to belong to some other life entirely separate from the firelit kitchen, where he currently sits. Clara listens without interrupting, and when he finally asks, somewhat abruptly, why she has never remarried in the 2 years since her husband's death, given that a woman as capable and quick-witted as she plainly is might reasonably have found another respectable match, she answers directness that stops him short, telling him that the small dowry of trust a second marriage would require of her, the willingness to again hand her whole material security into another person's keeping, is not a trust she has found herself able to extend to anyone since Michael's death, and that the work she does now, however society judges it, has at least the singular virtue of belonging entirely to her own management rather than any husband's. It is a small confession, offered without any apparent bid for sympathy, but it lands on Nathaniel with unexpected weight, and he finds himself, in the silence that follows it, reaching across the narrow kitchen table to take her hand in a gesture that surprises them both with its lack of any practiced seduction, simply the plain, human impulse of one person wanting to offer another some small physical comfort against a hard truth just spoken aloud. On the morning the storm finally breaks, 5 days after Nathaniel first stumbled snowblind through the Whitlock Inn's door, the sky over the Hudson Valley clears to a hard, brilliant blue above snowdrifts, so deep that their work crews will spend the following week simply cutting paths through them wide, enough for a single wagon to pass, and word reaches the inn by midday that the rail line south toward the city has finally been cleared enough to resume limited service. Nathaniel packs the same ruined overcoat he arrived in, now dried and brushed as clean as Ezra's staff could manage, and finds Clara in the kitchen for what both of them understand, without either saying it aloud, will be their final private moment together. He tells her, with a sincerity that surprises them both, that he does not know how to carry what happened this week forward into the rest of his life, that he loves his children too completely to ever risk the stability of their home, but that he does not believe he will ever fully stop thinking of her, a confession that Clara receives with a small, sad smile rather than any bitterness, telling him only that she hopes he holds his children a little closer for having spent these strange days snowed in with her, and that she will remember this week, whatever comes after it, as the one time in her adult life she let herself be fully and unguardedly known by another person. The rest of the household says its own goodbyes that same morning. The temporary family, the storm assembled, beginning to scatter back toward their separate lives now that the roads finally allow it. And there is a bittersweet quality to the whole scene that even Ezra, watching from behind his bar, finds himself unexpectedly moved by. Dr. Fear setting out at first light toward the birth he has spent 5 anxious days worrying over, arriving, as later word confirms, in time to see both mother and infant survive the delayed delivery in reasonably good health, a small mercy that lifts the whole household spirits on an otherwise heavy morning. Dr. Pierce, in fact, becomes something of a recurring figure in the story. The Whitlock Inn tells of that storm in the years that follow, returning periodically to check on Ezra's household during his rounds through the valley. And it is Pierce, more than anyone else outside the inn's own staff, who first raises with Ezra, in the difficult months following Clara's death, a concern that will eventually shape the innkeeper's later, more attentive approach to his employees' well-being. Pierce tells Ezra plainly, during one such visit some months after the funeral, that he has seen this same pattern before in his years of practicing medicine across the valley, a grief that settles over a person so gradually and so quietly that those around them mistake its steady deepening for simple sadness working itself out in its own time, when in truth it has become something considerably more dangerous, a warning Ezra receives with the particular bitterness of a man realizing too late that the information he needed to help Clara had been available all along, if only he had known enough to ask the right questions of the right person while there was still time for it to matter. Fanny, the youngest of the inn's women and the one who had known Clara for the shortest time before the storm, carries her own private version of this same regret for years afterward, remembering, in the weeks before Clara's death, small moments she had noticed and let pass without comment. An untouched supper left to go cold, a lengthening silence during what had once been lively shared mornings, preparing the day's meals, small signals that meant nothing in isolation, but that Fanny, the King Banny, looking back with the particular clarity grief lends to hindsight, comes to recognize as a pattern. She simply lacked the experience at 19 to read correctly in time. She speaks of this only once, many years later, to a niece who asks her about the old half-forgotten story of the tavern's tragic winter, telling the girl, with a directness she credits entirely to what she learned from watching Clara's decline, that the kindest thing any person can do for someone they love is to ask directly, plainly, and more than once, whether they are truly as well as their composed face suggests, rather than trusting silence to mean nothing simply because silence is easier to leave undisturbed. Prudence Marsh departs for her sister's farm with a promise, kept in the years that follow, to return each winter to check on the stable hand's progress with his letters, and the farmer, having endured 5 days of anxious separation from his livestock, departs at a near run the moment the road proves passable, leaving behind a small collection of new friendships that the household will speak of fondly for years afterward, even as none among them fully appreciates. In that bustling morning of departures, particular private grief quietly settling over the two people who had found rather more than shelter in each other during those same 5 days. Nathaniel leaves the Whitlock in that afternoon aboard a wagon, making the slow, difficult journey toward the nearest cleared rail station, and Clara watches him go from the same frost-caked window where Ezra had stood 5 nights earlier, watching the storm that would eventually deliver a stranger to his door. Nathaniel's return to his own household that same evening unfolds. He will privately reflect many times in the months that follow with a strange and disorienting ordinariness that feels almost obscene set against everything the preceding week had held. Margaret meets him at the door with the particular relief of a wife who has spent 5 anxious days assuming, without any way to confirm otherwise, that her husband might well be among the storm's uncounted dead, and the sight of her open, uncomplicated joy at his safe return, followed quickly by his 2 children's delighted shouting as they run to embrace him, strikes Nathaniel with a guilt so immediate and so physical that he has to excuse himself to the washroom for several minutes before he can trust his own composure enough to sit down to the supper Margaret has kept waiting for him. In the weeks that follow his return, Nathaniel finds himself living a kind of quiet double existence entirely contained within his own mind, going through the ordinary motions of husband, father, and merchant with an outward composure that satisfies everyone around him, while privately turning over, again and again in unguarded moments, the memory of a snowbound kitchen and a woman whose plain honesty had cut through years of comfortable, unexamined distance in his marriage more effectively than anything Margaret herself, through no fault of her own, had managed across 8 years together. He considers, more than once in those first weeks, writing to Clara with something other there than the gentle farewell he eventually does send, entertaining briefly and guiltily the fantasy of some arrangement that might let him keep both his family and whatever he found at the Whitlock Inn, recognizing with the same clear-eyed honesty Clara herself modeled for him during their days together, that such an arrangement would demand a dishonesty and a divided heart that neither his children nor Clara herself deserved to be subjected. The letter he finally writes 6 weeks after his return takes him 4 separate attempts before he settles on words that feel honest rather than either cruel or falsely hopeful. And though he tells himself, sealing the envelope, that he is doing the kind and responsible thing by closing the door, plainly rather than leaving it open to false hope. He carries a private uncertainty for the rest of his life about whether a kinder man might have found some better way to end it than the one he chose. He tells his family a version of the week's events that is true in every detail except that the one that matters most, describing the storm, the crowded inn, the kindness of a tavern keeper who took in stranded travelers without complaint, and watches his own children's rapt attention to his storm. Stories with an ache in his chest that he understands, even as he feels it, he has no right whatsoever to indulge. She returns to the ordinary rhythm of her work in the days that follow with an outward composure that satisfies Ezra and the other women well enough, though Ezra himself, watching her more closely than he lets on, notices a quietness in her that had not been there before the storm, a stillness that settles over her in unguarded moments, and that he attributes, not incorrectly, to the particular kind of grief that comes from losing something a person was never entitled to keep in the first place. A single letter arrives for Clara some 6 weeks later, posted from New York City, written in Nathaniel's own hand. And though she never shows its contents to Ezra or to anyone else at the inn, the effect it has on her is plain enough to anyone watching her read it at the kitchen table. Her face, passing through something like hope before settling into an expression far harder to name. What the letter says, Clara alone ever fully knows, though the small collection of words she is later heard repeating quietly to herself in the weeks that follow, half to herself and half to no one at all, suggests a farewell rather than any promise of return, a gentle, honest closing of a door. Neither of them had truly expected to remain open once the ordinary world reclaimed them both. The months that follow bring a change in Clara that those who knew her before the storm find difficult to watch and harder still to interrupt, a gradual withdrawal from the easy warmth she had once brought to her work, replaced by a careful, private sorrow she guards as closely as she once guarded. The details of the week she spent with a stranger who came in from the snow and left again once the roads cleared. Sally, who has known Clara longer than anyone else, still working at the Whitlock Inn, tries several times across that difficult year to draw her back out of herself, insisting she join the other women on their rare free evenings into the nearby town, sitting with her by the hour on slough afternoons, trying to coax out whatever private grief Clara has otherwise kept so carefully contained. And though Clara accepts these efforts with outward gratitude, Sally comes to understand, well before the year is out, that her friend's withdrawal runs deeper than in any evening's distraction can reach. Ezra, for his part, quietly shifts more of Clara's duties toward the inn's kitchen and away from its common room over the following months, telling himself and anyone who asks that he simply needs help with the cooking, though both he and Clara understand well enough that the true purpose, the particular ache of watching other travelers pass through the same room, the same corner table, where her own week with Nathaniel unfolded. It is a kindness Clara accepts, without ever quite acknowledging its true motive, and one that buys her, in Ezra's own later estimation, perhaps a few more months of steadiness than she might otherwise have managed, though not, in the end, enough. Ezra, in the year that follows, tries more than once to draw her back into the life of the inn, offering her lighter duties, encouraging her toward the company of the other women. But Clara's grief, whatever private shape it has taken in the year since Nathaniel's departure, proves resistant to every ordinary kindness offered to ease it, until, in the early spring of the following year, not quite 13 months after the storm first carried a stranger into her life, Clara Doyle is found by one of the inn's other women in her own small room under the eaves, having taken her own life. Sometime in the quiet hours of the previous night, leaving behind no letter of explanation beyond the single, worn page Nathaniel had sent her the previous spring, found folded beneath her pillow, its creases gone soft from months of repeated reading. What the letter said, in the small portion of it Clara once read aloud to Sally during a low, unguarded evening some months before her death, was not cruel in any way. Sally could later recall only final, Nathaniel Neal writing that he would carry the memory of their week together for the whole of his life, that he believed she deserved a future considerably brighter than anything he was in any position to offer her, and that he hoped, with what Sally remembers as evident sincerity, that she would in time find a life for herself unburdened by whatever hope his own letter might otherwise have kept alive. It was, Sally always maintained afterward, a kind letter by the ordinary measure of such things. Exactly the letter a decent man in an impossible position might reasonably write. And it was precisely this decency, this careful, well-intentioned finality that Sally came to believe had wounded Clara more deeply than outright cruelty might have, since a cruel letter could at least have been dismissed as the true measure of an unworthy man, while a kind one left her with nothing to be angry at, only a closed door and the quiet, ordinary tragedy of loving someone who had done nothing wrong except fail to be free to love her back. Sally, who finds her that morning, will say afterward only that Clara had seemed, in her final weeks, quieter even than her usual quiet, and that none of the household had understood until it was already far too late to matter how completely her private grief had settled over her, a grief none of them, however genuinely they cared for her, had known how to reach or interrupt in time. Ezra Whitlock buries Clara in the small cemetery behind the local church that same week, paying for the modest stone himself. And for years afterward, he tells the story of the storm that brought a handsome stranger to his door, or only reluctantly, and only ever with a heaviness in his voice that his regular customers learn, over time, not to press him further about. Word of what became of her never reaches Nathaniel Hargrove directly, and he goes on, in the years that follow, to raise his two children into adulthood in the same comfortable New York City house. He returned to that spring, carrying whatever private grief and guilt he hold the week he spent snowed in at the Whitlock Inn, without ever learning the full weight of what his departure ultimately cost the woman who loved him for it. He does, in fact, consider returning to the Whitlock Inn on 3 separate occasions across the following decade. Twice, when business travel would have carried him within a half-day's ride of the crossroads, and once, some 4 years after the storm, purely out of an unresolved restlessness. Never fully explain even to himself. But each time he ultimately turns back or alters his route at the last moment, telling himself that whatever he might learn by returning, whether comfort or fresh grief, was not information he had any honest right to seek out at the cost of the family he had chosen in the end to keep whole. It is only many years later, an old man himself by then, that Nathaniel finally learns, through the entirely unrelated coincidence of a grandson's business dealings that happened to carry him briefly through the same stretch of the Hudson Valley, that the Whitlock Inn still stands, run now by Ezra's own son, and that an old stone in the churchyard behind it bears a name he recognizes instantly and carries with him in silence for the remainder of a long car ride back toward the city, understanding only then, decades too late to matter, the full and irreversible weight of what his own carefully worded, well-intentioned letter had actually done. The story Ezra tells, in the end, is not one he offers as any kind of romantic legend. However, much later travelers passing through might wish to hear it that way, but as a quiet, sorrowful caution about the particular danger of a connection formed too quickly and too completely under circumstances neither person chose. A warning he delivers in his later years, with none of the wistfulness a more sentimental storyteller might have brought to the same events, only the plain, tired grief of a man who watched someone he cared for disappear by degrees over the course of a single hard year, and could find no way, however he tried, to call her back from it in time. The storm that brought Nathaniel Hargrove to the Whitlock Inn's door is remembered today, in the histories written of it, chiefly through its numbers. The more than 400 confirmed dead across the Northeast, the drifts measured in the dozens of feet, the week of paralyzed rail traffic that stranded thousands of ordinary travelers in places never intended to hold them, and it is easy enough, reading such histories, to imagine the storm's true cost as fully accounted for in those figures alone. The storm's more lasting legacy, in fact, reaches well beyond the immediate winter of 1888, reshaping the practical infrastructure of cities across the Northeast in ways still visible generations later. New York City, in particular, humbled by a storm that had snapped its overhead telegraph, telephone, and electrical wires by the mile, leaving the city as isolated by broken communication as it was by impassable streets, began in the storm's immediate aftermath the long and expensive project of burying its utility lines underground rather than stringing them overhead, where a single severe winter could sever them again, a change that later urban planners would credit as one of the storm's few genuinely constructive legacies. The same storm's demonstration of just how completely surface transportation could be paralyzed by weather alone lent new and urgent weight to proposals, already under quiet discussion among city planners, for an underground transit system immune to snow and ice, proposals that would eventually mature over the following decades into the subway system later generations of New Yorkers take entirely for granted, a direct, if distant inheritance from the same storm that once stranded a merchant named Nathaniel Hargrove at a small crossroads in well north of the city he was trying so hard to reach. What such histories rarely record, because there was never any official register kept for it, is the quieter, slower toll a storm like this one can take on the people it merely stranded rather than killed outright. The private histories set in motion during a handful of accidental bound days that no death certificate or newspaper column ever thought to trace forward to their eventual, equally real conclusion. Clara Doyle's name appears in no history of the Great White Hurricane. Her grave in the small churchyard behind the Wicklock, marked by a modest stone Ezra paid for himself. And if her story survives at all beyond the memory of the handful of people who knew her, it survives only in the reluctant, careful way old innkeepers have always told such stories, passed down the same rural crossroads where a storm once closed every road out of a small tavern for 5 unrepeatable days and left, in its wake, far more than snow. Ezra Whitlock, in the years that follow Clara's death, becomes, without ever describing himself in such terms, considerably more attentive to the quiet science of trouble in the women who work under his roof. A watchfulness born directly out of his own belated recognition of how completely he had missed, or perhaps simply failed to know how to address, the depth of what Clara carried alone through that final year. He begins a small, informal practice, never written down or formally announced, of checking in privately with each of his employees during any particularly difficult stretch of their lives: a widowhood, a lost child, a hard winter of few customers and thin earnings, offering not solutions he knows he cannot provide, but simply the plain acknowledgement that he has noticed their struggle and stands ready to help however a tavern keeper reasonably can, a small and imperfect corrective that nonetheless, in at least 2 documented instances in the inn's later years, town records suggest may have made a genuine difference for women in circumstances uncomfortably close to Clara's own. It is, Ezra tells the rare visitor who asks him directly about the old story of the tavern's tragic season, the only meaningful penance available to a man who spent a hard year watching someone waste away in plain sight, and told himself, wrongly, that grief was something a person simply had to be left alone to work through in her own time. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and leave a comment. Good night.